Thank you so much, Emily. That was so interesting. And you did such a great job, I think, of highlighting a lot of the different questions that we often hear. And I'm sure that you get them all the time. As soon as you tell anybody that you're studying COVID, they have all these questions for you. I think it's really interesting how you were studying a different university. And so I have a question for you, and anybody else, feel free to type your questions in the chat as we go along. But my question to you is this: what differences have you seen between tech and ACU?
Well, tech wouldn't let me test the athletes. uh, well, I think one of the main differences, at least in terms of numbers, is that ACU is requiring compliance and tech is not requiring. They're not enforcing compliance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in terms of numbers, ACU is down because at tech they're not requiring or not enforcing. I think there's a difference there between enforcing and requiring.
Yes.
That's one of the main differences I'm seeing. And now I'm starting the sequencing of these samples, so we'll see what variants we have in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know yet. We'll see when we first got that new variant in the samples here in Abilene. I hope it wasn't until 2021, but.
Oh my goodness. So you're probably going to be one of the first people to find out if we have that variant in West Texas in your data.
I bet we already have it.
Yeah.
But see.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, you'll have to give us an update when we send out the video. Let us know if you found it so we can tell everybody else. So this actually relates directly to a question from one of our faculty members. Ting Lin asks, she says, well, our new semester is starting tomorrow here at Texas Tech. From your experience, what can we learn from ACU and from others in terms of our COVID response before most people get vaccinated? What recommendations would you offer our system and our leadership, as well as individual faculty members?
So I think it's about practical guidelines, right? College students, if you want them to be on campus, not going to follow every rule that you give them. So I think it's important to balance what you expect and what they're going to do. Mm-hmm. So I think the colleges that have done like pods or groups of students that like are going to live together, interact together, are doing the best. So campuses, because you have on the campus in Lubbock, there are like 40,000 students.
Yeah.
So bringing them back in the fall,
Yes.
Throwing together 20-year-olds with all these exposures, and then they just didn't want to follow the rules. And I don't blame them. I went to a big college too. They wanted to have fun. Mm-hmm. So I think you just have to balance that. And ACU was able to control it because there's only 5,000. It's just different. The scale is different. And I understand wanting to be able to offer in-person classes, but if you're a faculty member and you have some sort of comorbidity, if you have, if you're worried, if you're over 65, you have to keep distance. You have to wear a mask. You have to have a plexiglass, whatever. There's just no other option right now. I think that distancing, masks, and then pods of students, that's the way for big.
Yes, it's so hard because everybody just feels like, well, the vaccine is coming, the vaccine is coming. And so they have a tendency to let down their guard. But I mean, how long is it? You have to take 2 doses anyways. How many weeks is it between the 2 doses?
4.
4 weeks. So you take 1 dose, you wait 4 weeks, you get a second dose. And then how long after the second dose before you're actually likely to be immune?
So they say 2 weeks, but the problem is that second dose is only going to give you immunity if the people around you are not infected. So you need the people around you to also have had the vaccine. If they don't, then you're not as immune as you would be. Vaccines only work if everyone gets them. Herd immunity only works if people are willing to get the vaccine.
Oh my goodness.
And right now we have a supply issue, right? We don't have enough. People are not getting it. And, that's the issue. We need more. And college students need it, but also our nursing homes need it. Also our teachers need it. So it's really hard to balance.
Yes. All right, well, we've got a lot of other questions coming in here, so let's get to another one. Linda asks, are we going to be more prepared next time for what we've learned from COVID? Because you mentioned at the very beginning that you thought a different virus would be coming. So the whole community was preparing for a different virus, and then along comes this COVID variant. So if we get hit with another one, because I think it's something like, what is it, like every 30, no, not every 30 years, like almost every decade, we seem to have like a new virus that comes out, like the bird flu, the swine flu. So when something else comes along, what will we have learned?
Well, there is an Office of Pandemic Preparedness. There was an Office of Pandemic Preparedness. Unfortunately, the Trump administration systematically, closed it, devalued it, fired those people. And I think that we will see a new Office of Pandemic Preparedness because after the 2009 H1N1 swine flu, they built in infrastructure, at least plans, for combating a global pandemic. I think that we'll see something like that again, and that will help us move forward at least faster than we have this time. Because this time, we didn't really do anything. We just, the US federal government sat on their hands for 12 months. So, at least in my opinion. But, that's fine. I think the CDC is culpable, just like the federal government. They didn't do enough. And now we will pay for it. But the vaccine companies really busted their butts. So that's awesome.
Yes. And it's interesting that President-elect Biden's chief of staff, a guy called Ron Klain, he was in charge of the Ebola response for the Obama administration. And now he's the actual chief of staff for the White House for the incoming president. So that shows, I think, the real emphasis and focus on this and awareness that this is a problem.
I think they're bringing in people. Well, first of all, they're bringing in people with experience who are trained in the areas that they need to be. So, I forget the name of the chief of staff, but he worked on Ebola, and the Ebola response was appropriate. Ebola never left, West Africa. And kind of what we want to see in these pandemics. We didn't want COVID-19 to leave China. Unfortunately, it did. So when it does, we need some sort of global response team. At least if the US is going to try to lead the response, we need a national response team.
The other good news too is that Biden just appointed his new science advisor, and they elevated the position of science advisor to a cabinet position, which has never been before. And they picked somebody, Eric Lander, who was part of the Human Genome Project of decoding human DNA. And so there's a real emphasis, I think, on the health sciences. And they're keeping Francis Collins in place, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health. And Francis Collins has actually done a great job with a number of different videos that he's done that I've seen through an organization he founded called BioLogos, where he talks all about vaccines and COVID and what we know. So there's a lot of really fantastic resources out there. Okay, we're getting more questions here. So
it would be nice to have a science advisor.
Yeah, exactly. There was one for half of the Trump administration, but the latest headlines on the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy of the White House last week was that some people published a bunch of reports and claimed that they were produced by that office, and they were not. And those reports were full of debunked climate myths that have been debunked, years and even decades ago. So it was a little bit of a scandal that they released these reports and said that they were official government reports when they were not. But that's a different topic. All right, so let's see. Angela asks, so we haven't seen this scale of global pandemic for a long time. In fact, the last time we saw it at this scale was the Spanish flu, which actually was responsible for the deaths of both of my great-grandparents. So in some ways, it provides a giant study opportunity. Yes, you are thinking like a scientist, Angela. Always make lemonade out of the lemons. What do you think, Emily, will be the most significant scientific discoveries or advances that will come out of this in terms of discoveries?
Well, I think the primary one are these mRNA vaccines. That's fascinating technology. Also, the new one, the Oxford, whatever it is a DNA. So it uses the adenovirus cell to deliver. It's a DNA vaccine, but it uses the machinery of adenovirus to deliver the vaccine, which is fascinating. If you've not looked it up, you should. But those in themselves are really interesting. I also think there will be new new surveillance methods.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to figure out how best to test for COVID. It's going to be, we've already seen this antibody test, rapid tests. I've seen people doing it without extractions. It's PCR without extractions. Got the biotech side is going to be really interesting. I don't think there's going to be a lot of advancement in disinfection. I think Lysol is Lysol.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it works.
But definitely monitoring and testing. Like I did my graduate work at the University of Illinois, and really early on, they developed a super fast test, and they've actually been applying that super fast test to every student on campus every week, I think, which has really been absolutely incredible. But it was a saliva test, so it wasn't a swab test. And it just made it really easy to test large numbers of people, which means that you catch it a lot quicker and you can really shut down any potential clusters. Ken has a question. So why did this variant of COVID hit us now as opposed to like 50 years ago or 50 years in the future? Is it just a random roll of the dice, or is there some actual identifiable now's when it would happen factor?
So some of it has to do with population density. Right now, the population density in areas like Wuhan is really high. I forget the exact number of how many people live in Wuhan, but for example, Beijing and Guangzhou have like 35 million people. When you have a city of that size with a market that has, like I said, 30 species, live species that are slaughtered on site, it's one of those things. When it comes, it comes. So
yeah,
it just was unstoppable.
Mm-hmm.
And because people are interacting, people are all around each other, and we just don't, it's hard to imagine in the United States that kind of population density, because we don't have it. New York City is less than 9 million. The smallest cities are bigger than that. So it's the scale for us is hard to imagine. But I think that the mutation, yes, is the roll of the die. The gain of function mutation is basically, luck. Where it happens is important, because once it's transmitted to a person, it's kind of, connection with other people. It just goes boom, boom, boom. And then if there's not the appropriate biosecurity, there's not enough checks, you just can't stop it.
Well, that makes sense. It's almost like you have this giant stack of dry wood, and then you have much smaller stacks that are a little bit on the wet side. If you toss a match, which one's going to catch on fire? So Wuhan, with the huge population and the live animal markets, is sort of like that giant pile of wood just waiting for a match. And in fact, I remember back in spring, seeing a reference to some thriller novel that was published in the 1980s that specifically had a virus coming out of Wuhan as the plot.
Yeah.
So it can't be a huge surprise to people who study this that would be like, if you might have like almost like a top 10 list of where you expect the viruses to come from, and that would have been one of the places. Would that be fair to say?
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we've got lots of questions here. Let's see. As in geologic time, is this going to be a significant event? Are biological pandemic significant events in geologic time?
Unfortunately, I think that depends on the death toll. So we can't say.
Right. Yes. Sort of like the Black Death too. I mean, that was definitely a significant event for many reasons.
Hopefully, because the vaccine was developed so early, they know, but we don't know yet.
Okay. Oh, here's a question that's kind of, it's one of the ones that as a scientist, I think is kind of fun, but it's also very disgusting and somewhat scary. As climate changes, the permafrost is thawing. And as the permafrost thaws, microbes and bacteria that have been trapped in that permafrost for a very long time are coming to the surface. So for example, in Siberia a couple of years ago, there was an anthrax outbreak that was tracked to the decomposing carcass of a reindeer that died like 70 or 90 years ago of anthrax, and it had been frozen the whole time and it had thawed. So the question is, what's the level of concern for seeing another virus or bacteria that's just as infectious come out of the thawing permafrost and tundra?
Well, luckily viruses are less stable than bacteria. Although I have some data that it's unfortunate on this virus, but generally, if you have something frozen for a long time, the virus is not what's going to survive. It's going to be that anthrax or that, bacteria, that DNA that's really hardy and it's going to last. It could be like an adenovirus, I guess. They last forever. But generally, a virus is something that's hopping from thing to thing to thing to thing, and it's every time it replicates, and it's replicating all the time. So the virus is detected in the permafrost and melting layers. I don't think some have been infectious to humans.
That's good.
But that doesn't mean they won't be, or that humans moving into those areas potentially won't interact with something that we haven't interacted with, or some sort of plant species that we haven't been around, and it could cause a reaction that is different. I think that it's very likely if we don't pay attention, it's going to happen. And that's the problem. So we have to be watching these things. Surveillance is very important. And that species happens all the time.
Yes. And that could be one of the big scientific advances, like you said, that come out of this is just our ability to surveil and detect and monitor on a regular basis. So Anand has a question. He says, what's the concern of viruses coming from CAFO facilities? What are CAFO facilities?
CAFOs, so confined animal feeding operations.
Okay.
This is something else that I'm from North Carolina, so we have pigs. Doesn't have pigs, but this is a great question. It's a huge issue, especially from the waste. And in the US, we have really strict biosafety regulations on CAFOs in their waste. Actually, you can't even build pig, swine waste lagoons anymore unless they are covered and they have really specific in-ground kind of lined tanks. Whereas in China, they don't have such regulations, and there are lots of concerns about these CAFOs. So something that groups are doing, something I was doing before COVID, was working with CAFOs. So paper I really need to finish is on swine
You
waste.
and me. Yep.
It's on novel viruses and swine waste. Finish it one day, but yes, there are lots of human pathogens in swine waste. One of the problems working on that in North America is that swine farms are owned by companies and they do not let you do research on their farms. Now, I don't know if that's true for cattle farms or chicken farms, but in North Carolina, it was like an act of God to go onto one of those farms.
Because they didn't want you to know.
No.
I would assume.
It's proprietary.
Right.
Proprietary
until somebody gets infected.
Right. Also, the communities have these big lawsuits for the smell. I mean, yeah. There's a big concern.
They've all seen the Aaron Brockovich movie.
Oh yeah. But you're right. It's not just viruses. There's heavy metals. I mean, that waste is definitely contaminated. And what do they do with it? They spray it onto the fields. So not only do you have going into a probably unlined pit, if it was built before 2010, they then let it settle into a big sludge pit and then spray the water onto the field, onto crops, or onto grass that cows, pigs, whatever eat.
So it just goes around. Oh, okay. We have, so you mentioned that from the perspective of what you do and what you know, you feel like the US did almost nothing. But one of the huge success stories is New Zealand. Just give us a few highlights. What did New Zealand do right in basically beating COVID without a vaccine?
Well, they actually, enforced their, regulations. They requested that people stay home and they social distance and they wear masks really early on. And they actually, we said that we were going to do this whole quarantine thing early whenever we started in March. But by March, they had already stopped transmission because they had quarantined early. So if we had quarantined in January, stopped transmission completely, then it wouldn't have even gotten to the places where it is now. So that's what they did, is they stopped transmission so early that it didn't get into places like here. So it's, what do we say? What was it? The phrase they used? Stopping the curve, slowing the curve.
Planking the curve.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they actually did that successfully. We did not.
They did. No, it's really amazing when you look at the numbers. And there's a couple of other countries around the world that are doing incredibly well. I think
Flattening the curve.
Thailand is one of them. Oh, we actually have somebody from New Zealand on, on the webinar, which is great. David's comment is here in the chat. He says, "Hi from COVID-free New Zealand. Thanks for making this awesome webinar timely for us today here too. It's midday tomorrow in New Zealand." So there's a little bit of time travel there. That's why this is so great. So we normally did these events at a local pub, which we absolutely love, called The Local. That's its actual name. It is a fantastic pub where the owner, Mike, is a great person who really cares about climate change, sustainability, environment, recycling, and it's rare to find such great kindred spirits here in West Texas. And so we are absolutely devastated that we haven't been able to meet in person since last spring. But on the other hand, we're able to do this virtually. I mean, Emily, you're in Abilene. David, you're in New Zealand. Abby says she's in Northern Ontario, and we're able to all connect and learn, which is really interesting. So there's one question I've been saving to end with, but I want to ask you one more question now. And that is, we had another one of our Texas Tech researchers, Ted Reed, give a Science by the Glass in August, where he talked about his research on not on vaccines, but a medication that would actually slow the symptoms of COVID. So if people got it, this would actually help slow down the symptoms. And he was talking about how a lot of student athletes were getting COVID because they were interacting with each other. And at some point, I think something like 80 members of our Texas Tech football team have had COVID out of like 100. And probably now it's actually maybe, I don't know, a lot more. And he was talking about how they had actually been measuring heart inflammation in some of the student athletes that made them really concerned about their athletic performance. Have you heard anything about that since then?
So I haven't heard anything about heart inflammation, but I know that athletes have really struggled with this virus.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I know they want to play, but the honest to goodness fair thing to do would have been to cancel all sports this year. Mm-hmm. So I'll have to follow up. I'll look up Dr. Reed and figure out how to follow up on that and what their study is doing. But yeah.
I mean, he wasn't the one specifically studying this, but other colleagues were studying it. And their concern was short-term versus long-term. I mean, the students are playing now, but if they end up with some type of damage that could actually affect their long-term career, I mean, it's just heartbreaking.
So also, some of these students that catch it have the really severe consequences, like kidney problems, neurological problems. You never know who you're going to be in the fallout from this virus. Some people just have really severe outcomes.
And is there any, I'm sorry, I'm kind of cheating a little bit. There's an extra question here. Is there any indication what makes people more vulnerable to that long haul COVID where the symptoms just go on and on and on?
So far, there hasn't been anything. I think that's what we're going to do next in the molecular studies. Mm-hmm. Try to see if there's a genetic difference. Maybe it was a strain difference. Maybe it's a type of infection, like how you caught it. Maybe that makes a difference. But so far, there's just not enough data, not enough to say one way or the other.
There's nothing really obvious about older, young, male or female. I
have seen that males are more likely to get it, but I think females have sometimes more severe disease. But I wouldn't take any of that. We need more data. It's too early.
Yeah. You're going to be crunching the data on this for the next decade or more.
I know. I have a pile.
Oh, okay. So last question, and this is a really perfect question given the topic of this webinar. Let me go back. It's actually Abby's question, which is, what lessons do you think scientists have learned from the pandemic that could be applied to climate change?
That's a good question. Mm-hmm. I think, first off, I think it's that we actually need to pay attention to what's going on in the world around us because it sneaks up on you. Mm-hmm. So by ignoring climate change, throwing it under the rug and saying, we'll deal with that tomorrow or our grandkids will deal with it is totally the wrong response. Just like saying, oh yeah, they're eating birds over there. Or, oh yeah, they're viruses, but it's in China. It's not our problem. Well, the answer is it is our problem, Mm-hmm. It's not just a Chinese problem. It is a global problem. And, climate change is not just a 2100 problem. It's a 2020 problem. It's a 2000 problem. We should have been dealing with it before now, and we continue to ignore it. We're going to be covered up. There's no other solution. But I hope that surveillance and developing these, methods for dealing with it, come with it. I don't know if it will. I hope that science, takes a more frontal role. I'm waiting for that. I've been waiting for it for a long time, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Emily, for this really fascinating talk and for all the great questions you asked. And everybody stay safe, wear your masks, and we'll see you again in a few more weeks. Bye.